And I think we'll get started. My name is Anthony Bonbank. I'm one of the TIS here with Best Prep. I've done this a few years, but I haven't for a few years, and everything is different now anyway, so I don't know how much help that experience really is. But I've been working and studying with a lot of different kinds of people over the years about what do we do with digital learning, and this is before the pandemic. A little bit of background: I've had this last year, and then in previous years when I taught in high school, I've had a essentially paperless classroom. I started as a pilot in 2013 and full time in a couple of subsequent years after that. And honestly, I haven't collected paper. I haven't written on students' papers in years. And that kind of, it's a big mindset shift that I think a lot of people have been almost forced to with the couple months of distance learning that we've done. And one of the questions that came up a lot was, well, how do I grade this stuff? Because it's not what I typically would get. I can't sit and watch the kid work through it. I don't know if it's authentic. I don't know if it's something that they got from another site. How do I know what they know? How do I set up ways for them to show what they know in a way that makes sense to them, in a way that's going to make sense to me, and so on. And that came up as a potential topic for this conference. And so I kind of brainstormed some of the best practices that I've seen, but a lot of it is going to be a touch point for you as you think about your own practice. How comfortable would you be with some of these ideas? So I'm going to share my screen, and we are going to kind of jump into this now. And I have some slides that I'll show you, and again, you can go through the slide deck with me if you would like. So some of the things that were kind of brainstormed as we go, what does quality formative assessment really look like, and what does it look like digitally? Alternate assessment strategies. What does assessment look like if it's not a test or a quiz? And for me, in the early days of trying to kind of go paperless and digital, that was a big shift for me because I used get out a half sheet of paper, answer a few questions for me as an exit ticket, as a bell ringer, as a way to stop in the middle of something and do some of those quick assessments. And then, of course, that went in the grade book, and that essentially colored their grade. And then I'd knock off 50% if something was late, or 25% if something was late. And the whole grading thing has always bugged me because it's rarely, at least in my traditional practice, it's rarely ever actually reflected what the student learned. And it's not even really designed and built at the systemic level to do that. And so that was one of the challenges, I think, of distance learning. And I think a lot of us, just as teachers, have been trying to figure out what is the key to that. And I don't know that I'm that much closer now than I was before, because at the end of the day, especially in secondary, in the high school I teach, everything still needs to come out to be just a raw number. And we've, in my district now, have things set up between formative and summative. So those are the two weighted categories that we have. But it still only goes so far. So I'm going to talk a little bit about alternative assessment strategies like project-based learning, and self-paced learning. Audio and video assessment strategies, which we never really ever thought about before, because if we wanted to know something from a kid, we could just ask them. They were sitting right there with us. Badging and gamification, that's going to be something that I think is worth considering because it truly is an alternate way of grading. And I did some of that in our distance learning. And some of the kids responded to it pretty well. Portfolios, minimizing academic dishonesty. I think that's something that was the first big panic button for a lot of teachers in secondary for sure, is anything I put up here, it seems like they can cheat so easy. And so how do we back out of that to think about how do we make something that is a little bit more cheat proof? Or how do we make it so that there would be no incentive to cheat because they wouldn't be a big advantage? And so look, let me talk through a few things. And if you want to kind of raise your hand, I'd like you to just say your name, and then I'll stop, and then we can entertain a question or a conversation as we go. So the first thing about grading, I think, is just understanding that grading is like the worst way of saying we're giving feedback, because grading so infrequently truly does that well. We think of it as assessment, but when we think of assessment, we're thinking about multiple choice tests a lot of the times. And so I often invoke our colleagues who work in industrial tech, who work in art, who work in music, who work in some of those encore areas, because they really understand assessment to be something considerably different than, say, my English teacher colleagues who have a harder time with that. If it's not a paper to grade or if it's not a test to grade, we have a hard time really getting that assessment part. But it's really about the feedback. And so even with my students, sometimes I ask them, do you want the easy coach or the hard coach if you want to win a game? And most of them get that right away. They understand that the hard coach is going to be the one that challenges them the most, but the prize at the end will be much better. And shifting out of that mindset of just needing to jump through the hoop and just earn enough points to get the whatever and so on. That's a real shift from intrinsic to extrinsic and so on. But going back to the original traditional, even with an answer on an essay answer or on a paper, it resulting in an A- good job doesn't tell anything. That's not a good coach at all. And I know that I've received this kind of feedback a lot, and a lot of you have as well. And I think we know that doesn't do much for the kid, even though the A- might feel like the Congressional Medal of Honor for that student, because that's they wanted to get into the A range and they didn't think that they would get that. For some students, that is enough. That's all they need. But they'll never understood what got them to that point, or they'll have a harder time with that. And just saying 4 out of 5, but you missed a few things in the rubric, again, unless they know what specific things in the rubric they missed, they are going to come back with the answer of why wasn't it a 5 out of 5, or what did I miss? And you might even have a pretty detailed rubric, but without the ability for them to see that. And instead there, I put an example of what actual feedback might look like. And it's specific. That idea of specificity in feedback, I think, is even 10 times more important when you're working with digital assessment than it is in the traditional classroom, because I think we have understood now how many different little interactions happen in our classroom that we never thought of. That little bump on their shoulder and saying, hey, I'm glad you got your paper in. That conclusion really came along. That's something that they don't get now. And they don't get even just the high five because they turned in a paper. They don't get some of those little ego puffs as they go. So we have to be really specific about what it is that we think that they're doing well. And I think that that's one of the key parts of the grading part, is the grade, whatever that grade supposedly looks like that you have to turn into your school, that should reflect something that the kid should be able to sit back and say, that is a B because on my paper, I reworked my conclusion because the first time I had it, it wasn't this. And when we took this one test, I had to relearn two different concepts, and eventually I got it to whatever range we wanted it to be. So part of it is revisiting what the FOR in formative assessment really is. And it should be the idea that as they're learning, they should find a way to be able to evaluate how they're doing as they go. And we should be giving them some references with that. And the part that's lost again with the digital learning or the distance learning is we can't walk around the room and lean over and say, you're doing a really good job with that, because we can't necessarily look over their shoulders to see what they're doing all the time. So we have to find different ways to figure that out. And part of it is we know that some of our students will say, I'm checking this out and I can tell it's going well. Or I figured out part A and I'm ready to move on to part B. And that might be a really informal interaction that you have with the student in the classroom. But now it's going to be digital. It might be an email. I finished stage 1. Here's what I know about it. And here's what I'm still wondering. And what structures are we setting up for them to discover that? And that's really what formative assessment is. And a lot of times the first thing that goes into the official grading is the quiz or the test at the end of that part. But there really should be something lined up to that that doesn't rely on consequential grading. Something that can go in the grade book as a completed or incompleted, or a 1, 2, or a 3. Something that I experimented with early on was making daily assignments worth almost nothing, so that those daily assignments ended up being done because they were seen as a direct path to learning. And even if that was more of an intrinsic or an extrinsic, well, yeah, I want to do well on the final whatever, but they understand that that's a pathway, and then also that that's a pathway that they can come back to. So we have in our school, we have something called POLs, proof of learnings, and anybody can retake or redo any summative that they need to if they make sure that they go back through a proof of learning. And in some cases, that is going through and doing the work that they didn't do the first time. In other cases, it's going back through and doing a different kind of exercise to help them know. And then sometimes they have to use that as proof that, yep, I'm in a better position now to show what I know. But we should also start thinking about discovery learning. How do we help them find out what they need? How do they generate terminology they don't know and then help to explain it? I needed to know what Krebs cycle was because I was studying photosynthesis, and I needed to know more about that to complete my project about why my sunflower isn't growing very well. So I think that there's ways to build some of that in, and in some cases, I think we're better set up for that now, or in a digital setup, than we maybe even were in a classroom. And part of that is just the classroom as it was just wasn't set up really well for it. Role reversals, how will they teach it? And again, that's part of that is getting back to think about all the Q&A that you do in a class and how easy it is for a student to ask their neighbor, I don't get this. Can you show this to me? And they might use different terminology, but those interactions are happening dozens of times every day in our schools. And if it's distance learning, what's replacing that? Are they texting each other? And what does that look like? Or are we putting together a format for them to be able to do some of that co-learning? I know that in my classroom, there's a lot of that going on where I could just see them leaning over each other's screens or papers and saying, well, yeah, it's here. Do you understand how this works? No? Okay, well, this, and they're reteaching. And that's such a higher level way of showing understanding. Do we have structures in place for them to do that? And it'll come up in a future slide, but one thing I kind of tested and it went pretty well was just an open question board. And at first I gave a badge and some kind of incentive to put a question in and to answer it, and we had to kind of work through who needed to get a laugh and who didn't. But there was something really meaningful at the core of that, that there were a few kids that posted a question that other kids, and sometimes, and this might have been your experience too, sometimes it was the quiet kid who had never raised their hand, who was answering in a really detailed way. And that's an almost impossible thing to grade A, B, C, D, but you certainly can encourage participation in that kind of conversation that probably would have happened otherwise. And as I mentioned before, unlimited trials, we want to give them as many opportunities to learn and understand things. And one of my experiences was my kids would just burn through something. They wouldn't get anything from it. And they really didn't have any intention to learn it. They were just trying to just knock something off of a checklist. So part of it was finding a way to get them to go back and slow down and actually interact with what was going on. Formative assessment and distance learning, some of the ideas: writing good questions, posting it to a discussion. Write a rubric. Here's what I'm going to be asking you to do. What should the rubric look like? What would be your suggestions? What should your rubric look like compared to what you personally are thinking about improving? Students, at least the students at the age level that I work at, they're pretty aware of what they're good at and what they're not good at. In fact, some of them can't quit telling you how bad they are. I'm just a terrible writer. I can't spell. I can't do whatever. I can't math to save my life. I never know what's going on. Maybe those can be parts of a rubric that they can write up for what they're going to be doing for their summative task. How can they illustrate or multimedia interpret vocabulary terms, foundational concepts? Video practice to self. I learned this from the choir teacher who my daughter has, and I keep hearing her singing in her room, and I said, what is that for, a test? And she said, no, he just wants us to record for ourselves run-throughs of certain songs, and I have to do at least 5. And I said, where do you turn it in? He said, we don't. We do a self-evaluation at the end about what we saw different in the 5 different trials. And I thought, brilliant. What does that look like in an English classroom? What does that look like in a math classroom? Where could we get them to do that, where we maybe spot check, or we maybe do a check-in where somebody can talk through, or maybe say, here, this is where you're going to post it. And I think that was the situation too with this teacher, that the teacher really wasn't looking at it, but it was an accountability thing of, I want to just see that you had 5 entries. But in the end, what you're going to do is you're going to compare your own. Taking pictures in their world of ideas or concepts and trying to explain that. What do you find and see with this theme or with this standard? And I'm starting to see web quests, which I think is of such a early 2000s era kind of thing. I think that they might be more relevant than ever now, with just this dearth of information and so much of it bad, that find me a quality resource to explain what you're learning. Find a quality reference to this. If you wanted to learn more about Othello's Venice, where would you look? What would be a good starting point? How would you validate that? And I think that the web quest maybe looks a little different now. It's probably not quite as much of just a random run through everything and to just do a scavenger hunt. But I think that there's still ways to have them dig in and learn as they go and say, well, I read this website, but it was only so-so. But they're getting something out of that. Alternate assessments, formative and summative project-based learning. I'm a big fan of that. And I think for those of us who may be tasked with starting the school year online, I think that this might be a good way to start with our big rocks, is to present at the beginning what we're going to be doing as a final project for it. And that project shouldn't be the cherry on the top after you've done all the boring work. That project should really be something that you dig into at the beginning so that they start to figure out, what am I gonna need to know for this? If I'm gonna be doing a TED Talk on something that's gonna be my choice, what is that? And what do I need to know about public speaking? And what do I need to know about TED Talks? And in some cases, I think they're gonna be able to brainstorm or come up with for you ways to validate and quantitate that line of thinking. And I'm a big fan of kind of flow sheets that don't have very many words from me, but with big boxes and squares where they can do some random writing about what were the topics you thought about, what did you think about and turn down, what was your thinking about this. And some get pretty verbose about that, and some maybe just do bullet points, but I encourage that thought process and the way they're working through their movement from idea to idea to idea to do some metacognition about that, so that they can talk about afterwards, you know, where that took them and where they are at. And then that grade and feedback becomes more authentic, because it isn't just that they did that, but that they met a certain part of your roadmap. And that roadmap, if you think about taking a traditional rubric with maybe 4x4, 4 criteria, and 1, 2, 3, 4 on it, and you think about stretching that out over 6 weeks for a unit, what was on that rubric that you could check in on over and over and over again? And this is something I think elementary teachers do really well, and I think secondary teachers as a rule do pretty poorly, is can we check back on our development of the same skill? And part of that is elementary teachers are working with really particular skills, where for me as an English teacher, I think of it as 6 years of quite a few teachers teaching theme over 6 years. Well, what is that nugget that they want to jump back into that has to do with their final product? And that product might be a creation, that product might be a performance, a product might be a paper, but what does that look like? What are these workshops all about? And then what does that look like? And I really love the idea of having, here's where I was on this date, here's where I was on this date, here's where I was on this date, and this is as far as I got with this one thing. And I'm okay with that because I can't do it all right now. So for something like a paper, but this could be a lab, this could be some kind of design project, it could really be anything. And that's something that I think is worth brainstorming over, especially if it's something that you suspect is already a unit and you don't know how to break that down. That's something I'd be happy to talk through with you, or even just talk through your colleagues. If this wasn't a final test that once and for all showed what they learned in 6 weeks, what would be a way for us to track these same things in a project? What would that project look like? Self-paced learning, and this really depends a lot on what your tools are, and we were fortunate enough to have Schoology. I think that to some extent that this can be done in a lot of different ways, but I think if you don't have the perfect tools, I think that the labor ends up falling a lot on the teacher to have this all set up. But even with Google Docs, we have ways to be able to have a hot linked checklist, so to speak, of this is what needs to happen and then this. And the big problem is what happens with the kid that finishes a 2-week project in 3 days, and what happens with the kid that is about a week late, and how do we manage that? And I think we learned a little bit about that during the distance learning time, in that if they finish early, maybe that's just okay, because that's probably not the only thing going on in their life and their work. But if they want to learn more, what do we have for them to do? Can we suggest something without it being that the reward for finishing early is getting more work than anybody else? But can that be something where, hey, can you pop into a discussion then since you're finished and find out if anybody else needs help, if you're willing to do that? Some kids really enjoy doing that. But we talk a lot about what's loose and what's tight. So what I've typically done with self-paced things is the pacing of how you get from step 2 to step 3 is all you, but step 3 is due on this day. And so if you want to burn through it all right away and get it all done and then just kind of coast until we get to stage 3, that's okay with you. But the tight part is we start stage 3 on, say, Thursday. And that's the day where we're going to launch everything else. Between now and then, you have these things that you need to do, and you need to check them out with me to make sure that they're quality. So want you to work on that. And of course, some are going to work on it Wednesday night at 11:35, and some of them are going to finish the evening that you have it due, and some are going to kind of get lost in that. So then even how do you break that down for a lesson by lesson? You should at the very least accomplish this, but you can move on. You should at the very least finish this, but you can move on. And sometimes they will be aware enough to say, I needed a little bit more time with this, but I know I'm not going to need as much time for that part either. And that gets really crazy. I taught online credit recovery this summer, and some kids are really great at that, and some are just not. And maybe that's a choice. Do you want the self-paced track, or do you want to follow what I want everybody to do every way, everything as we go? Audio and video assessments I had to learn to love, especially teaching a public speaking course, which my first thought is, how are we going to do public speaking in this format? And here we are at a conference that is usually based around public speaking, and we're doing it. So there was a paradigm shift, but using Flipgrid really kind of got us. We even did debates, and we could have done live debates on Zoom if we wanted to, but having structured debates where they could come when they were ready to do their rebuttal and have a direct rebuttal to the video that they just watched, or to stop and think and rewind a little bit to think about what they just heard. I realized that that's a different skill. It maybe is not a debate skill, but it is a different kind of skill. So sometimes we get, I think, some increases in some skills, even though it might not be the best setup for other skills. And I think we need to be really aware and open to that wherever we can see it. I think the audio and video tools today are considerably better than they were 18 months ago. And whatever your district provides or doesn't provide, chances are there are free versions out there that you and your students can use. And at the very least, almost all of your students carry around a video and audio recorder in their pocket. And so there's ways to work with that as much as can be. And so one of the keys to that, though, is, do they know what you're looking for? Have you modeled what you're looking for? Is there a way to show what you're looking for without having them give you 30 versions of exactly what you showed them? Here are some best practices, I think. Part of it is access, and some of it might be automatic, like every kid has a Chromebook or an iPad. Some of it might be making sure that there's internet access in the home and so on. But that access thing can be a real frustration for a kid who's being asked to take a video and can't because they don't have the right tools at home. But assuming access, the next thing, and I learned this the hard way, is the clear expectations, because you imagine that it's going to go exactly the way you think it's going to go because you wrote that sentence saying, do your whatever via video. And then you get a whole bunch of them that don't have any actual talking heads to them. They've all put up a picture or they've blocked their screen, and yet you wanted to see their faces, you wanted to see facial expressions and so on. So you almost have to think like a student that absolutely doesn't want to do any of it. What are you really asking them to do? Do you want to see like more of a speaker kind of setup? I think most of us now are pretty accustomed to kind of the setup that I think we're doing right now, sitting at a table or a desk, and we're looking pretty much directly at our camera and so on. But what are the kids going to be doing? Do we want to see their face? Do we want to see their torso like they're a news presenter? If it's something where we want to see them do life as a talker or as a speaker talking to us, then maybe we show them some clips of some quality versions of this from TED Talks and so on. What do those look like, and what are those expectations going to look like? But we need to model what we expect to see. And I think it's important for them to see us doing it. And part of that is putting our own mask on first before helping somebody else. If we are unwilling to do the audio-visual version of what we want them to do, then how can we reassure them that this is a safe and okay kind of thing to do? Do it and be imperfect, and show them that it doesn't have to be perfect. And I think this is more personal suggestion, but I think we over perfect things as teachers because we want to look good. And I don't think our audience of students is looking for perfection. They're looking for humanity. And so when we do our video presentations, whatever it is, I think we need to be as human with that as possible and maybe talk about it afterwards. You have a really monotone voice, Mr. Von Bank. Yes, I understand that. I get much more animated when I can see real faces, and so that's something I'm trying to work on. What do you think would be better? What are you working on? And so on. And I think we need to show some humility in that because we're all learning, and especially in terms of what we're trying to assess, we need to make sure that the grade of A isn't perfection. The grade of A is I learned what I was supposed to learn in a full enough way that I can own it now for good. And so the inviting of the self-assessment, what did you see about your performance that you think should be part of your public record? What if you were going to grade this on an ABC scale, where are you today, and do you want another shot at that? Here's just some ideas of audio and video assessments that I have kind of alluded to along the way. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I think explaining with personal narrative is something that I think almost every area can do. And the one that I maybe don't see it as easily as math, and I think that's where they are working out and explaining their process. So it might be an understanding of a theme or a concept, or it could be understanding a process, but they need at some point to be able to look at a camera and say, okay, here's what I'm really fuzzy on. I don't understand this part at all. I'm trying to work out how to figure out this. Let's say it's an outline. And I understand what the thesis parts look like, but I cannot figure out what goes on the conclusion. So I'm not going to talk about that right now. That's going to be on my work on part of my list on my flow sheet or something like that. Okay? And then that can be your formative grade, and that might be in the grade book. Just that's a 3 out of 3 because it showed the 3 things we're working on: self-awareness, understanding the path of where we need to go, and progress. Maybe those are the 3 things I look for in every formative grade, and it's just going to be 3 things. Or maybe I only saw 2 this time, and I want to remind them that they need to do that better the next time to have all three components. But have that rubric, whatever your expectations that you want to have in the grade book, it really needs to be lean and memorable and repeatable, so that every time they make a video thing, they're remembering the top three things that you're really looking for. And that's much more valuable to them, because then they get in the mindset of hopefully they can do that as they go forward. All right, badging and gamification. I can't get deep into this because I think there's so many different ways to do this, but I think we are modeling that within the TIW, and you'll be able to see what this looks like. But this can honestly be anything. Schoology has this built in, which I love. If you dig into it a little bit, I started doing these, like show your dog in your video, or find a typo I made in the instructions for something from this week. And I gave badges for master proofreader or dog lover or something like that. And the kids just kind of ate it up. And it was a way for me to create community, and I'm going to talk about that in my other group, but it also opened the door to say, I'm going to have a badge for anybody that can get their outline completed to at least a 2 on the rubric by whatever. Now, that's something I don't have to necessarily put in the grade book, but it is a way of quote unquote grading them or assessing them on their work. That's there too. And I might have made a badge for, it could be something dumb like my outline is coming along. That's the badge. You win it. Nobody can take it away from you because you are there. Or we've been working on a whole bunch of academic terminology, or this could be science terminology. It could be just about anything. What badge can they get for learning the first half, or to get 50% finished? Because that gives them another, now you let them know you've got another badge at 75%. That's really worth working on. And I've done this with everything from vocabulary to spelling to terminology to completion in a project. And there's some really neat different ways to do that. But I think a lot of you have seen bingo and tic-tac-toe boards. That does 2 different things. It gives them a playlist that they can work from. It gives them voice and choice in what they're doing. And it also feels a little bit fun or amusing. And I know that that's in short. If you ask a 10th grader, they're not going to be that entertained by it, of course. But if they had the choice between that and sitting and doing a worksheet, most of them are going to pick the tic-tac-toe board. So don't get too turned off when they say, oh, this is stupid, because they still probably would pick it over just answering questions on something. But let's not forget our digital tools like Kahoot and Quizlet. And if you've never checked out Quiz is like a Kahoot, but you can set it so that it is asynchronous. So over the next 24 hours, they can take the kind of quiz game and see how they did, and they'll still have a rank at the end. So that one is really neat. And then there's some other ones that might be more specific to your area. Some kids hate Study Island. I don't know that I really love it. My own kids hated it, but it does definitely reinforce some of the ground level learning. And so, as I know we're kind of running out of time here, just to encourage you to take a look at portfolios. They really have never been easier. I tried to do this with paper and manila folders back in 2004 or something, and it was just not, it just didn't work. It was too much work. It was too much of everything. And now, whether I want to do it in Google Docs or I want to do it in Schoology, I have a place now where they can have a portfolio of learning. And to have them do a presentation of their portfolio, I think it's a real world skill. I think it's a college and career readiness skill. And I think that it is good, authentic assessment. And I think it can turn into a a meaningful grade in the grade book as well. And I think that might even be something that they collaborate with you to tell you, here's what I feel like I learned, and based on maybe this rubric or what have you, this is what I still need to learn. So I think I'm here with this, but I think with my effort, I think I would combine those into an 85%. But as the class goes on, I think I can do better. And I think that you can integrate multimedia with that as well. Academic dishonesty, and I know we're going to run out of time on this, but part of it is breaking free of the idea that that they have to know it out of their own pure brain at the moment you ask that. And if that's what you want, you have to get them on the hot seat in video, one-to-one, and say, I need you to tell me everything you know about the book that you just read. And if that's really your goal, that's the only way to really know that for sure. Because we just don't have a lot of other ways to do that when they're at home. But I don't think that's a bad thing. There's a couple things I learned about even the tests and quizzes that were part of my PLC is that the thing that I had cheated on the most, or that more kids cheated on than anything, was an open question essay test with 5 questions that required a paragraph each. They did more copying and pasting from one to the other, or somebody must have posted it on their Snapchat story or something. I don't know what, but I got this with the same spelling mistakes and so on, where I realized that there's really not necessarily anything wrong with the multiple choice as long as they're dig deep kind of multiple choice. And if that sends them to SparkNotes or Google to try to work out the answer, they're learning it then. They're learning it in that moment. So they might not have learned it from the first way we interacted with it, but if they're learning it now to be able to answer the question, there is a depth of learning there that's different than just copying and pasting. So I kind of learned to break free of that idea that the only way you're going to get a good answer is if you have an open kind of question, because that doesn't necessarily do it either. But you can ask a question so tough that no kid would know it off the top of their head, and ask them to go into your notes, go into your text, go into Google if you want to, and I want you to research this and come back and tell me which one of these is the best answer. And I think that that's a little bit different way to do that. But connecting to their own life, I think, is good, as long as we don't make privileged assumptions about what their own life might be. So go take a picture of your car, go take a picture of your bedroom. These are privileged expectations that not all kids are going to be able to do. So that takes a real shift in our thinking to think, what could a kid really talk about in their connections with the material? As we said, project-based, and interpret a different part or invent a problem to solve. An example of this is when we read a novel this year, To Kill a Mockingbird, we gave each kid a different quote. No two were the same, and they were quotes from other famous people. And they all were quotes that had something to do with the themes in the book, and they had to make those connections themselves. And we had to coach them through that as much as we could. But they could go out to SparkNotes and they could read all they wanted, but it wouldn't answer their direct question. What does this quote have to do with To Kill a Mockingbird? So I'm going to leave you with this. I know we're out of time, but this is a Padlet, and I hope the link works, but it should take you to a place where you can brainstorm for yourself and for others. There's a pink button on the bottom here where you can click in and title what you're going to have and write something. Things that you heard that you want to try, things that you've tried that you didn't hear, things that you think would work well for somebody else but wouldn't work for you. What I encourage you to put something on here as you leave this session today. And I thank you very much for listening, and I'm sorry it was rushed and kind of a rush and rambly, but I hope that you found it meaningful. And if you want to talk through any of this more, please meet me in the independent sessions in the afternoon at some point, and I can certainly kind of talk through your ideas with this as much as I can. Thank you very much for being here and listening, and I hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Hi, Tony. Are you still there?
I am.
I typed something in the chat a couple minutes ago, and I'm not sure if anybody saw it. But I'm curious to know, in with rubrics, I use them pretty frequently. I teach math and social studies to 5th grade.
Yep.
I'm just wondering if you have a really good online and paperless format, because historically I've printed a rubric for each student, and then they have that as their guide as we're working through kind of checking through where we're at. When you had explained the kind of steps and check-ins.
Yep.
But now with the possibility of distance learning, do you have any suggestions? Because I have mine all basically in Google Docs for formatting. But is there a way, like, can I convert that to check boxes so I don't have to go through each one and like create a bubble to circle where they're at that current moment? Or do you know of a better website or program to use, I guess, for the paperless grading with rubrics?
Well, my first thought is that's cooked into, like, Schoology has that cooked in. They have a rubric kind of creator, which once it's done, you can just bop, 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 and give feedback. But what they don't have, and when we talked to them before, they'd ask us, well, how do you like the rubric function? And we said, well, how do the kids interact with it? And they said, why would the kids need to interact with a rubric? And we said, well, we want the kids to be seeing where they are as well. And I mean, that's just what happens when businesses try to do educational stuff. They don't think of the important stuff. So I think what I'm hearing you say is you want something neater and cleaner that maybe both sides can use to do a quick check.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know that there's the perfect tool, but something that is similar, and it wouldn't look in your mind like a rubric, but using Google Forms to align to your rubric. So what they're looking at on their rubric might have the real detailed impression, but maybe you and they are using a Google form that has all of the same criteria as Likert scales 1 through 5 or drop downs or something like that, where they can go back to that each day or each check-in, and then on your end, and you could even publish this so that they could see how they themselves are doing, and there's a little bit of crossover. How much do you want students to see of each other? But you could have the student make one from your template and share it with you, and then you could have a whole list of hot links to each kid's one-on-one form for their rubric.
Okay.
And this is something that they do in special ed a lot, where the kid makes a rubric from the template and then they share it with the case manager or whatever, and then they just have that right, or they even hot link their name and click on, okay, Chelsea, and then they have it saved somewhere on their end too.
Sure.
Where am I with this today? And you might have to change that out for every unit or whatever, but that's probably the best thing I can think of. I'm not aware of a third party that does what you're imagining. Although I imagine it exists, it's probably not free.
Chelsea, do you do Google Classroom?
We do.
I do not. We have Schoology.
Okay.
We do Google Classroom, Anna, and at the 5th grade level, so our elementary is K-5, of course, and high school does full Google Classroom, and we just had dabbled in it a little bit, so we didn't get in depth. We used it kind of more for posting assignments and some scoring things of just assignments. And then we had to do some things on Seesaw, which was a complete nightmare, to be frank. But so Google Classroom, I would be interested in.
So Google Classroom, when you post assignments on Google Classroom, just this spring they added the rubric option. So you can create your rubric for the assignment. And once you create it once, it's saved. And then you can, if you want to use the same rubric, even if it's just like a self-assessment rubric for the week,
Sure.
You can repost it every week.
And that's found in the assignment section?
Yep. So when you post and create an assignment, you have that option of creating the rubric there.
Awesome.
If you're just using Google Docs, one Chrome add-on that I've used is Orange Slice.
Okay.
And that's more from the teacher perspective. It's I used that before Google Classroom added the rubric option, and now I pretty much just use the rubric option.
Okay.
But
awesome.
Orange Slice is good if you just need to grade a Google Doc, something, and then it'll just be added in there too.
Okay.
Would you post that on the Padlet?
Yeah.
That would be great.
Awesome.
For some reason, I had to log into Padlet first. Now I have to try to get back in there, but
Oh, shoot.
I'll try it again.
I thought I had that. They keep changing it on me too.
Well, thanks for the information. What a great session.
Thank you. It's weird just staring at a screen and not being able to see any faces.
Hi. All right. Thank you so much. I appreciate the information you shared.
Thank you. Have a good day.